How to create overworld scenarios in the turn-based tactic project. Or actually, I'm going to show you how to use the environments you created to move the units around in the overworld. If you don't know how to create an environment that supports the overworld movement, you can go back and see my previous video in which I was showing how to build an environment for the turn-based tactic project, and then you'll be able to reuse that environment to move your units around in the overworld. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to look at all the blueprints you need to add in the level to be able to control the units in the overworld, move them around, and trigger combats. So let's get to it. So in Unreal, here you can see that I have a completely empty level with nothing in it. So on the right here, you can see that the hierarchy of my level is completely empty and I don't have any other levels inside that level. And today we're going to add all the elements we need to start from an empty level all the way to a level that is usable in the overworld and move the units around and trigger combats. And the first thing we need is an environment. If you don't have an environment yet, you can just generate one yourself or use one of my pre-made environments that are already in the project in my demo folder. But in my case, we already have an environment that we built in the previous video, so I'm just going to reuse that environment and drop it inside my empty level. Here we go, as a sub level. So now I have a new environment level inside my level. So here it is. You don't have to make it a sub level if you want to have all your blueprints that are controlling the overworld, the mechanics inside your environment directly. You can do that, that's not an issue. In my case, I'm just setting it as a sub level because I think it's just super simple to hide the level if I don't need it, bring it back if I need to, so I can focus on the elements that are only in my persistent level, not the elements that are inside my art level. And also it's going to be super simple to swap between levels if I want to. So if I want to replace this art level by another one, I can simply hide that one, show the other one, and it's going to work without having to change all the other components of the level. So the player actions, the grid, the combat system, and the overworld unit group manager. You won't have to change any of those because they are all inside the persistent and the art level is inside another level. But that's just my technique. You can do anything you want depending on your workflow. So here we go. I have my art level right here. I'm going to make it always loaded because I don't want to do all the logic to load the level today because that's not the point of today's video. So here it is. I have my art level right here, and now we're going to focus on the other elements. So we have the art that can support the movement of the unit using the nav mesh. Make sure that your art level has a nav mesh inside it because the unit are going to walk on top of the nav mesh. But now we're going to hide it and focus on the other elements because we also need a few blueprints in our level. We need the blueprint that lets the player interact with the game, so the BP player action. We also need the overworld, the blueprint, the one that manages the overworld, and then we finally need the combat system and the grid to be able to trigger combat in the overworld because that's the main mechanic of the game. We want the player to be able to trigger combat, not only move around in the overworld, obviously. So I'm going to add all of those. I'm going to go in my core folder and start with the player. So in my player here, I'm going to add the BP player action in the level. So that's the player. He's going to interact with the other components of the game. Then we need the overworld, the unit group manager to control the units in the overworld. And that one is inside the units folder. Here it is. We have the BP overworld, the unit group manager. So I'm going to also add that one in the level. And finally, all the combats elements. So in my combat folder, I have the combat system. Here it is. And I have my grid in the grid folder. Here we go. So the player is going to interact with the units that are inside the overworld via the overworld unit group manager. And when a unit decides to trigger combat against another unit, the overworld unit group manager is going to send a message to the combat system to start a combat, which is going to happen on top of a grid, obviously. So good. Now we have all four elements we need to be able to create an overworld scenario. We now just need to link them all together because now they are not aware that the other ones exist. They are all in the same level, but they don't know the other ones are there and that they should all work together to make the game happen. So to do that, I'm just gonna select, let's say, my player action first, and I'm going to set the combat system variable that we have right here to the combat system, and also the overworld unit group manager to the overworld unit group manager that is inside the level. So now the player is aware of the overworld unit group manager here, and also of the combat system right here. And the combat system also needs to know where the grid is in the overworld. So this is the grid right here. So the combat system needs to know that it exists. So I'm just gonna go in my combat system and set my BP grid. Here it is. So that's pretty good. Now all the objects are aware of the other objects and they can now communicate with each other. So that's pretty good. Now going back in the player actions, there's another thing we have to set for the overworld, the scenarios. By default, the player action doesn't select any action. It lets the game decide, okay, now you're in a combat context, so select those specific actions. Or if you're in a case like in the debug menu, for example, you want to be able to select specific action that the player has access to. You don't want the game to select those actions for you. You want to select them manually. But in our case, since we are going to create an overworld scenario, we want the player to be able to automatically move the units in the overworld once the combat is over. So as soon as the game starts, the player is going to select the action to select and move the units in the world. And then once the combat is over, it's going to reselect those actions, the action to move the units in the overworld, because we are in the overworld and we want to select those actions. But anyway, let's just check that little checkbox right here to tell the player action to automatically select the overworld movement actions, and that's gonna let the player move the units around in the overworld by default. So good. Okay, now all the components are set up, but I just realized that we don't have a player start in our level, so I'm just going to add a player start. It's not required, but it's always nice to be able to control where the player is going to spawn in the level, and in my case, it's going to spawn right here. Perfect. And actually, we're almost done. We set up everything. Now we just have to add the units in the overworld and tell them to move on the grid. That should not be too hard. So let's just set the level visible again. So here it is. I have my level, and now I'm going to add units on top of my level because I want to be able to move them in the overworld. So I'm going to add a few units. The position doesn't really matter, so I'm just going to add a bunch of those units, units here, units there, units here, units there, here, there, here, there, here, here, there, here, there. Here we go. Units. I have a bunch of units. Okay, they are a little bit low, so I'm just going to move them up a little bit, just like that. And if I want units of different types, right now I only have a bunch of warriors, I'm just going to change the type of my unit. So I'm going to scroll down here into the unit setup and change the type to, let's say, priests for these ones, and these ones here are going to be chickens, and these 3 units right here, maybe we want them to be bats. Maybe that one's gonna be a ranger, this one and that one over there are maybe going to be slimes. Here we go. Oh, actually only that one. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I have a bunch of different types of units, and now it's time to tell the Overworld Unit Group Manager that these units exist and we can control them in the overworld. And sadly, I have to admit that this part is a little bit clunky right now. There's no easy way to feed all those units to the Overworld Unit Group Manager directly without going through the BP Overworld scenario, and that's the blueprint that I have in my other folder in scenarios right here. We have the BP Overworld scenario, and that blueprint is really just responsible to take all the units that are in the level and feed them to the Overworld Unit Group Manager, and that's really the best way I have right now to feed those units. So we're going to have to use that blueprint because there's a few steps we have to do to be able to feed the units to the Overworld Unit Group Manager. So if we open that blueprint, we're going to see that in the begin play, I'm just adding a widget, doesn't really matter, and then I'm going to wait, and then I'm taking all the units group that are assigned to that blueprint. So we're going to set that inside the editor. Obviously, we have all the different units group that we want to feed to the Overworld Unit Group Manager, and the way I'm feeding them, well, is simply by looping through all of them. I'm setting the context of my units to be overworld, I'm adding the units in the Overworld Unit Group Manager, and then I'm setting the groups that are encounters to be encounters. That's pretty straightforward, but it's still a few steps and it's a bit annoying to do that. So either you copy this bit of code inside your blueprints and you create your own logic to make it nicer and like more user-friendly if you want to, or you can simply use the Overworld scenario to feed all your units to the Overworld Unit Group Manager and be able to control them in-game. And yeah, I know that's a little bit clunky and that might be fixed in the future. For now, I'm not really sure on how to improve all that, but anyway, that might change or not. For now, that's the way it is. So yeah, you have to deal with that. Sorry about that. But anyway, so we have the blueprint Overworld scenario that we have in the level right here, and inside that blueprint you can feed it, well, first the Overworld Unit Group Manager to know which blueprint we're going to feed the units to. When the game starts, we have to know where is the blueprint of the Overworld Unit Group Manager, and then finally we have the unit groups, and in there we can simply add all the units that we have in the overworld, and these groups are going to be fed to the Overworld Unit Group Manager when the game starts. And just to make sure that you know the difference, a group is different from a team. A team is in combat. It's used by the combat system, and it's deciding which teams are in combat, which units are fighting against which unit during the combat. But a group is simply a group of units that is in the overworld. Not all groups in the overworld are going to be part of all of the combats that happen, obviously. So that's why in the overworld you can have as many groups as you want. You can have 500 groups if you want, 500 groups of, let's say, 10 units per group. You can have as many groups and as many units as you want in the overworld. But when the player triggers a combat, only a few of those groups are going to be converted into combat teams, and these are going to be the units that are inside the combat. Not all the units that are part in the overworld, otherwise the combat will be pretty big. Yeah, that's an idea, but it's going to be a pretty long combat. Anyway, so yeah, you can have as many overworld groups as you want, but only a few of those groups are going to be converted into combat teams when the combat starts. So that's the difference between a group and a team. And now it's time to populate the groups that are in the overworld. So first, for a group, we need a group ID. That's going to be the same group ID that we have in the map right here and also in the group ID variable that we have right here. So let's say we're going to start with the group 3, whatever, doesn't really matter, it's just an ID. And then we need to assign all the units that are part of that group. So in my case, I can select, let's say, the unit 1 and also the unit 2. Means that now these two units are linked together, and when they are going to move in the overworld, they are going to move as a group. And then we have to decide if this group is going to be an encounter or not. The encounters are controlled by the AI in the overworld, and the player cannot select them. The player can only select the group that are not encounter. So the units that are controlled by the player, you can select them in the overworld and attack the groups that are encounter. It's either you're an encounter or not. If you are an encounter, you're just going to wait and move around until the player attacks you. And if you're not an encounter, well, the player can control you and use you to attack groups that are encounters. So good. That was for my first group. Now I'm going to add another group. That one's going to be, let's say, the group 76. Doesn't really matter as long as the second ID matches. So I have the group ID right here, 76 matches the first 76 that I have right here. Then we're going to select all the units that are part of that group. So let's say the 4th, the 6th, and maybe let's say the 10th unit, whatever, it doesn't matter. These ones are not going to be encounter because, well, we need units that are going to be controllable by the player. And now we're going to do the same thing for all of our different groups that are in the overworld. So let's say the group 9 now. Oops, we have to use the same ID, so 9 and 9, and then all the units that are part of the group 9. Here we go. I can add all of those. Here we go, here we go, here we go. And as you're probably starting to realize, this process can be a little bit tedious if you have 100 units in your level. So that's why instead of doing it all manually like that, I'm going to use this little helper function that I created inside the BP overworld scenario, the build unit groups based on unit names. So as long as all your units in your level have good names, this little function right here is going to be able to place them into the proper groups, and that should be a little bit simpler than writing all those units groups manually, one unit at a time. So that's why we're going to use this helper function, which means that we have to rename all of our units first. So I'm gonna go in my units and rename them all one by one. And the way it works is by simply adding underscore group in the unit name, followed by the index of the group in which you want to add the unit. So in my case, I'm going to add the unit 1 inside the group 0, and then the unit 2 also in the group 0, doesn't really matter. Unit 3, group 0 also. Then unit 4, that one I'm going to add it inside the group 3. Why not? Doesn't really matter. Group 3, group 3, group 3. I'm going to have a few units in the group 3. Then I'm going to add another group right here. That one, let's say group whatever, 9, group 9, group 9, underscore group, that one, let's say 7, and that one underscore group 8, that one underscore group 8, that one underscore group 8. Okay, good. So now we have a few groups. We have the group 0, the group 3, the group 9, the group 7, and the group 8. That's good. And now if I click on my build unit groups based on unit name, it should now generate those groups for me. So here we go. I have my group 8, my group 0, my group 9, group 3, and group 7. And the units that are inside those groups are the ones that have the underscore group in their name. So group 8, group 0 inside the group 0, group 9 inside the group 9. So good. It seems to work. The last part is the isEncounter boolean that we have right here that decides if the group is an encounter or not. And the way we can set this boolean is by either checking it manually. That's super simple, clack, 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 and these 3 groups are now encounters. That will work. But the other way we could do it is by simply adding the underscore AI in the group's name. So here I can have my group 3 underscore AI. So all my units in the group 3 are going to be an underscore AI because I want my group 3 to be controlled by the AI and be an encounter. So all of those are going to be an encounter. Then let's say my group 7 is going to be an encounter. My group 8, oh yeah, why not? I'm going to make the group 8 an AI also. Here we go. So group 8 is an AI, group 7 is an AI, and group 3 is an AI. Group 0 and group 9 are going to be controlled by the player. So now if I click on the build unit group based on unit name, it should update the isEncounter checkbox right here. You can see that now the group 8 is now an encounter, and if I look at the other ones, the group 0 is not an encounter, the group 9 is not an encounter, the group 7 is an encounter, and the group 3 is also an encounter. So that's pretty good. Now all the units are set up properly. They are all part of overworld groups, and now if we press play, we should be able to test all that. And here we go. Now we can see that a few unit groups are already walking around because they are controlled by the AI. They are the encounters group, and I cannot select them because they are controlled by the AI, but I can control the groups that are not controlled by the AI. The groups that are not not encounter. So let's say this group right here, I can move it around. I can select one of the unit with the left click and then move the units with the right click, and I can do the same thing with this one right here, which is also not an encounter. So I can move those units around, I can move them on the grid, select the other group, move it on the grid also, and it works pretty well. Then the other thing that we can do is simply trigger an encounter. So let's say I can move this group right here. I can decide to start an encounter using the chicken and a bat, and I'm going to attack, let's say, the priest that we have right here. So I'm going to right click on the priest, and now I'm going to walk all the way to the priest, and once I reach the priest, I'm starting a combat against that team. So now we have the chicken and the bat against the warrior, the priest, and the bat that we have right here on the right. And we can also toggle the tactical mode as usual, so we can focus on the combats and ignore all the other parts of the environment that are not inside the combat, because that's the size of the grid that was generated, and the environment is a little bit bigger than that, obviously. So we can enable the technical mode if we want to focus on the action. Otherwise, we can simply move as usual and just play the combat like any other combat. So I can move my units and my turn, move the other unit, cast some spell. I can wait for the AI to play its turn. The AI is going to attack me. I can speed up the game if I want to because it's too slow. I can end my turn a few times. The AI is going to maybe kill me, or maybe I'm going to win the combat, but in both cases I can simply end my combat, and once it's done I'm going to be brought back inside the overworld, and now I can move my units around once again and trigger another combat if I want to. So I can move these units now, and I can attack those units right here. Why not? So now I have a warrior, a ranger, and a chicken against those two priests and a slime. So I can move my units around, play the combat as usual, and once I'm bored or once I win the combat, I'm going to be brought back inside the overworld, just like that. So now you know how to create your own overworld level, and that's gonna be it for today's video. I'm gonna see you in the next one. Bye bye!